Hi everyone, my name is Joshi, and welcome to this Keyshot workshop video focused on in-context renders. Now, this is a follow-up video from a workshop that I literally quite just finished, and I thought to myself, why not make a video just so that for anyone who's missed that workshop or for those who've attended but just want a quick refresher, this is your one-stop shop. So, to start off, of what are a couple of elements that would make a in context render more believable or more realistic? Well, the first part is definitely by having a great in context background or pretty much your background. So there are a couple of places to find amazing or like high quality backgrounds. One of them being Adobe Stock. So if you're a SCAD student, for us, we have the Adobe Suite. It's paid for by SCAD, so if you log into your Adobe Stock account, you can get any of these stock images that you want. For example, if we were looking for a bathroom scene because we made a we made a sink or a bathtub, we can simply look for an image that has a bathtub or even a sink, and we can go ahead and grab that. And Adobe Stock, again, high quality images, great place to start off by looking for a certain background. Another place that you could look at is Midjourney or AI in general. There, I personally use Midjourney to come up with certain creative backgrounds that I might need. For sometimes stock images won't satisfy those needs. So, yeah, Midjourney or any other image creating platform would be really useful. Though one thing I'd say about these platforms is that sometimes they tend to look very AI because they're very saturated and whatnot. So just be aware of that issue. Okay, and the third and last way to grab a great in context background is actually just by using your phone, taking a picture, or maybe even setting up a certain scene or or background that you have in mind and taking a picture of it and using that as a background. So for today, we actually got our background here at Adobe Stock so that it's just more realistic for everyone for those because a lot of the AI platforms are paid. So Adobe Stock for SCAD students at least free. Now, another element that would set your in context render to be more realistic is your material. Well, for us, we've materials is actually a whole another video to talk about if we want to get into detail. But by having a high quality or very well thought out material, uh, that would really sell your in context render a lot better. And we can also say that lighting lighting is so important. It's probably one of the most important parts of making a good in context renders. So for lighting, there's a standard lighting setup in the filmmaking industry that also very much applies to our how we light our products in Keyshot. So it's called a 3 point lighting system, wherein we would have our key light, which would serve as our main direct light. We will also have our fill light. Fill lights are basically once we have like a very bright light source, there's definitely gonna be like a dark shadow. Now, the key for fill light is making that very dark shadow not completely like pitch black, and that would allow us to see a little bit more of the details of the parts that are in this dark shadow area. And we also have our backlight. Our backlight is basically there to make our product stand out from our background. So in a typical studio environment, we don't want our product to kind of blend in with the background. So that's what the backlight is for. And it could also be one of the contributors to make these wonderful like rim lighting kind of look. So yeah, those are the three main uh, lights that we would usually use in a Keyshot environment and even in the real world. So there's our lighting, which we will be applying later on. And lastly, our perspective, our camera. So there are a lot of settings that we can go over in a short bit, but by having the right perspective, by having the right camera angle, that would definitely go a long way for our in context renders. So with that said, let's begin. So for the benefit of everyone watching, we've already kind of set up our file. So you gotta first of all select your in context background. In our case, we did select our in context background from Adobe, which is this guy. And so we went ahead and went to Photoshop as well and kind of crop out or remove this phone because we don't really need it and it's a bit distracting, especially if we're going to be working on top of it later. And the way I did that was through using Adobe Photoshop. Adobe Photoshop has a really, really useful tool called Generative Fill or Generative AI, wherein you could like just basically lasso out this phone and then you could generate or tell it to remove this phone and it'll generate something like this. So, yeah, it's not the cleanest. Definitely, I do not know what I'm really looking at. It's some sort of cup, but at least it's better than this larger phone that we have. And it's less distracting. So, with that, we have our in context background, which is edited so that we have a bit more leeway with putting in our product or 3D model in. And so let's go back to Keyshot and let's import our background. So the way we can import our backplate or background is through going through our environments. And at the moment, we have this preset environment from Keyshot itself. We can go over to our settings and then look for the name backplate image. So click on that and we are here to import our in context background. There you go. So the image is now in Keyshot. So what's next? Great question. Taking a look at our environment, it doesn't really reflect or seem like it's the 3D model is in the same world or same lighting as the background. So the easiest way and quickest way to address that is through going to your HDRI editor and selecting background. And once you've selected background, this is where you could kind of manipulate the color a lot more. For those that want to do it manually or just as a fun fact, you could actually change how bright or dark your images are by just simply changing the background of your HDRI. So we could also change the the color of it if we wanted to make it more red and ominous or not. But in our case today, we're going to be looking at the image tab right here. We're going to go click on it and then click on the same in context background file or image that we use for our backplate. Click on that really quick, and if you can tell, we can actually turn off these pin lights since we don't need it and we want to start from scratch. And there you go. We have relatively looking flat 3D model right here, but then it's grabbing the color scheme and environment directly from the environment of our backplate. And so we can kind of tweak this at the moment. Let's click on background, and maybe it's too bright for us right now. Maybe we can tweak it down a bit. We're also tweaking it down so that we have more range in adjusting our lighting later. And we can go ahead and increase that contrast as well so that the colors that are in the image kind of pops up more or is more evident into our lighting environment. So yeah, there you go. And for those that have like these certain reflective parts, if you don't really want people to notice that, hey, that's it's reflecting the exact same thing as your backplate, well, you could remedy this by increasing your blur. Again, it depends on how much or how if it really does bother your whole in context render. So you have that option at least. And we've pretty much kind of set up the environment at the moment. We're gonna work on it again. We're gonna go back and forth on it later, because as soon as we change certain angles, some things that might not match up. So as of the moment, we've done the background, and let's move on into our camera settings. So for our camera settings, uh, I could show you a couple of things. So first of all, for focal length, at the moment it's set to a standard of 50 millimeters. The standard, I'd say, for a product to not look very warped nor weird, is from the range of 35 millimeters to around 50 millimeters. Now, this is a good range to work with, unless you want to make a certain effect or style. If we look at this 3D model closely, if I change this to a lower millimeter, like 24 millimeter, it looks like it goes through a like fisheye lens, or like it just makes your product a little bit wider than it really is. Now, if we revert this to, let's say, to the 35 millimeter, what we were talking about a while ago, it makes it a little bit more realistic, more flatter. Um, and the higher you go, the kind of flatter or further it seems to get. So if we were to go for like 100 millimeter, you see how it's slightly becoming flat, almost orthographic at one point. But that's why we would usually recommend around 35 to 50. In our case today, we're going to stick to 35. There you go. Has a bit more perspective onto it. So now we've kind of set up our camera focal length here. Let's now try to set up our 3D object onto the hand of our context user. So we can scroll out and zoom out into it to approximately the size you think your product might be at. We can use the twist portion here to adjust that to around approximately there. It's a bit bigger than I wanted. I could also use the distance tool to kind of just tweak it down a bit. Again, this is kind of like a iPad shuffle size, slightly bigger, but around this area seems to be good. And you could use your original reference image, like this phone, to get a sense of the angle or perspective that you want it to be. In our case, we don't really have a reference. Um, if you were to use a tool called Match Perspective is probably the easiest way to to align your perspective with any other scenes. You can use, if there was like a wall or like a line that's in the image that you could use as a reference, you could use easily use the Match Perspective tool. But for today, we're gonna do it manually and eyeball it, because we don't really have a anywhere to reference here. So again, going back, let's kind of set the angle again. Let's twist it, put it back, put it somewhere here. It's around this, and our perspective as well. Let's adjust it. So it's around here. Adjust it. We could take, again, if you were doing this by yourself, please take time to carefully kind of curate your shot. As of the moment, we're kind of breezing through it, and I think this is a good spot to leave our camera angle to be at. And don't forget to save, because once you start moving it around, you don't wanna kind of struggle getting the right angle back. So don't forget to save. And looking at our reference image, we get to see a bit of the side, like the image that we're seeing here. But and here we go. All right, that seems to be fine for now. Move it a little bit. There you go. Save, and then now, actually, yeah, I kind of want to make it slightly bigger. Sorry, I'm a little bit OCD on these types of things, so it does take a while sometimes to get it right, or to get it to where you want it. There you go. All right, click on save. Let's move on. Now, we've got our general environment set up. We've got our camera relatively set up, we could now take a look at our lighting. Lighting is, again, probably one of the most important things about setting up your Keyshot in context renders. So in order to do that, what we can go to the lighting tab, and first of all, you'd probably be on, as by default, on the basic tab. And I would highly recommend that you would start on a product, switch it to product, and maybe you could, as a standard, maybe you can go for your ground shadow quality around 5 or 6. But in our case today, we don't really have any ground shadow or need for ground shadow because we don't have any ground. The person is holding it. So as a standard, you would probably put it around 5 or 6. It's up to you. And then for general lighting, this is a very important tool called the ray bounces. So I would typically put that to around 16 to 15. You don't really need it too high unless you have a really, really powerful computer. So I could leave it around that end. Global illumination bounces. Again, I don't set it really too high. 8 or 10, that'll do. And here is, oh, before we skip over caustic, if you have any transparent parts or maybe see-through parts or even maybe translucent, you could turn on this caustics that it makes it more realistic, your transparent parts. But we don't have any transparent parts as of the moment, so we can go ahead and turn that off. And be careful with using caustics, because if you're using caustics and you're wondering why there's so much fireflies or like stray pixels, white pixels, or something similar to that, like laying around near your transparent part, this is probably the culprit of it. But play around with it. I only use it when I need to. If I don't, I'll turn it off. So rendering technique. Being an industrial designer, it's probably by default we should be like, hey, we're making rendering a product, so we should put in product mode. Well, in our case, since it is more of like a in context render as of the moment, to get a more realistic lighting, I would switch it over to our interior mode. It slightly differs by a bit. It just differs on how the lighting would play in your environment. So for in context, I would put it onto our interior mode. All right, we've got this section down. Now, how about setting up the lighting? You could typically use the add pin, like pin lights. We saw some examples a while ago from the default Keyshot presets. And yes, you can play around with it by clicking this tiny icon right here. You could play around with the lighting and see where exactly we want the light to be at. And for our case today, I wanted to introduce you to the concept of these lights. So if you click edit and then click add light, there are like certain physical lights that you can put in your 3D environments. So we have the area light, the IES light, the point light, and the spotlight. So for today, we're going to be using the area light, point light, and spotlight for our 3-point light system, which is, again, the key light, the fill light, and then the backlight. And we could probably, at the moment, we could start with the backlight, because looking at the environment, our main light source, it seems to be, is coming from somewhere here in this general area, this general direction. Because looking at this image, you're getting a bit of reflection from it, like a rim light kind of situation. So we're gonna try to replicate that by using the add light tool. And since it's more of like a direct light, we could use a spotlight for it. So I know what you're wondering. So do I have to move like the spotlight and every lighting on through using our camera over here, our basically our render view? Well, no, actually. There's an easier way or better way of doing this. If you look at your keyboard and click on O, we're going to have our geometry view pop up right over here. So for our geometry view, basically it's a really, really easy and good way to um, move around and kind of set up your environment without having to constantly be rendering and rendering your scenes over here. Because typically, if you'd move your cursor of your camera here, there you go. If you move it, you'd see it's your computer's having to struggle to render and render and render. So we don't really want that happening. Uh, so to remedy that, we are going to be using the geometry view. And again, because we're moving it here and not here, we can get a live feedback and live view of all of our changes in the exact same orientation we want it to be. So in our case, we're using a spotlight. And I know what you're thinking. What is happening here? What is this? We don't need that. That's not realistic at all. So that is because we have in our lighting, we have well, let me look for it. We have our no, it's I think it's in our settings. We can turn on the ground shadow, and in our lighting we can turn off our ground illumination. So our ground illumination is still on. So if you are in a situation similar to this, you can simply turn that off. Boop. And there you go. The light is still there, but it's no longer illuminating at our ground. So we have our spotlight over here, which is looking very, very bright and very, very, very direct. So we'll set it up in a spot at the moment wherein it feels like it's similar to the environment at the back, something like that. And something like that, where he's just catching the light at the edge or in the rim. So, all right, we can click OK. But I know it's still too bright, and it seems like it's not natural. So what we can do is double click onto your spotlight over here at your geometry view, or you could also double click it honestly on your scenes menu. Again, just double clicking on the spotlight opens the material, and this is where we can play with a couple more things on the spotlight. So we have the beam angle, fall off, and radius. For the beam angle, pretty much self-explanatory. You can mess around with it a bunch. Uh, I think for our case, since it's more of like a natural sunlight, we can shift it towards to a slightly wider part, and we are gonna move this light source actually a bit more to that area because we're gonna try to match our background environment light source to be something more like this. Okay, so something like that, right? Okay, and then for a fall off, we can increase that since we want it to be a bit softer. We don't want it to be too harsh, right? So increase that a bit. And our radius defines basically how big your light source is. Again, by just shifting it even a bit, our light source is incredibly huge. We don't really need it to be that big. So we're gonna stick it to maybe a little bit small, like something like this. Again, when you have the time, please do take more time to arrange all of this. So, all right, we have kind of our like rim lighting here, and it's still too bright, I think. So we could increase or decrease the power. In our case, we're gonna decrease it to around maybe let's ballpark it to around 20 and see how it goes. All right, that's slightly better. Maybe we can go 15 even. We really just need like the rim lighting here just so that it kind of matches the background. Okay, I think we can leave it there for now, right? And also, if you go onto your color, this is where you can adjust your temperature and whatnot, and that'll be very much useful for later on. But at the moment, since we're matching it to the background, it seems like it's a little bit more cool white than it is warm. So yeah, all right, we'll click OK. So there is our backlight. Next thing what we want is probably to make this a little bit brighter. So we're going to be using our key light now. So for our key light, we are using the add light tool again. And instead of the spotlight, we're going to be using point light. So a point light is basically, imagine a ping pong ball that is just glowing and radiating, and pretty much this is, it looks like the sun pretty much. So it is, I typically use it for areas that are, or lighting that is more of like a typical LED light bulb or something like that, just because it has a like a more softer touch to it. It's a bit, it's direct, but at the same time still soft. So um again, I we would try to move it around using the geometry view. And I think what we're gonna do here is kind of make it seem like the light is coming from above it, but it's also maybe a couple of the light is kind of, the reflection is the light reflecting off the skin or like the forehead of this human. So I don't know why I said it like that, this human. But anyways, so let's try to match it. Maybe the light source is around right here. Maybe move it a little bit to the side. Again, the light source that we have at the moment by default is quite spectacularly bright. So we're going to double click on it again. And this time we're going to be using Lumen. Lumen gives you a bit more control, specifically if you're going in the very, very low power situation. So watts, it's a bit harder to control because they're like 1,000 in watts is insane. If we put it to 100, it's still insane. If we put it to 5, it's still quite, if we put it to 5, it is still quite bright. So in Lumen, we could kind of change that a whole lot more specifically. And so instead of that, we could probably put it to around the range of 150. Let's see how it goes right now. 150 kind of looks pretty decent. Looks pretty good. Um, I can lower this a bit and put this somewhere here. Alrighty. So something like that. And then since the lighting, it seems like it might be a bit warmer tone. I feel like, especially if the lighting is bouncing off the forehead and then coming onto the um the 3D model, we could adjust it quite a bit. Maybe not super warm like this. That'll throw us really off, but we can, instead of making it cooler, maybe we can make it slightly warmer on the warmer tone, just to match the environment as well. Um, there you go. All right. So the radius, you can play around with the radius too. It just defines how big your light source is. For us, we don't really need it too big, so we can leave it around here. That's good. Try to be too big of a deal. All right. Now we have our key light. So if you want to take a look at the effect of each of these lights, you can go from 0 and start from the spotlight. That's our rim lighting. And then our key light, there you go. It adds to basically making this whole thing a bit more readable and brighter. And next thing that we're missing is probably the fill light. So the fill light again is there to make your darkest parts not completely 100% black or dark. So our darkest parts are probably along here at the edge of our product. So in order to address this, we would again use the add light tool and use the area light. So the area light is a little bit different if you can't already tell. It is in a very rectangular shape. So imagine this as like a light panel. And for our scene, this is a little bit too big. So we're going to scale it down a bit. And again, we can use our geometry view to scale it down so we don't really need to move out of our camera view. And let's scale it down a bit. We can scale it down a little bit more. All right. In case for those who are wondering how I'm actually moving about in the geometry view, it's similar to how we move about in the regular camera view. If you hold your left click, that's for you to rotate. If you hold your middle mouse button, that's for you to move around in the 3D space. So, okay, we're gonna try to match it, right? So that's not what we wanted. We want to kind of rotate it this way because we want the side to be illuminated rather, and we can push it back a bit towards the side where we can see it fine. There you go. Again, it's still a little bit too bright. We don't really need it that bright. So we can go ahead and adjust it again. All right. So you have our place over here. We can make it a little bit further too, I think. Area light. Make it definitely a bit further. A little bit taller like that. All right. So again, it's too bright. It's not realistic. It's supposed to be like the darkest, relatively the darkest spot of our product. So again, we can double click on the area light and we can adjust the lumens of it. So we kind of want it to be just a midge brighter than it originally was. So we can get it to around, maybe let's try 50. Okie dokie. 50 might be too dark, and we're getting that rim lighting effect that we don't really need that rim lighting effect for this. So can kind of adjust this a little bit more. Area light. Can honestly get a bit closer if we wanted to. Okay. Again, still too bright. We can adjust it. Maybe make it maybe 20 or something. Maybe even lower. And if we're already at a very like close point, we can always adjust it back. Back it up just slightly a bit more. There you go. So something similar to that. We just kind of wanted to be not as dark as it originally was. So I know you're wondering, this is why is this here? We're like, we have all these other light sources that are not really present in the scene that you can't see during your renders, but we can see the area light. So a quick and easy way to address this is through going through the materials of your area light and turning off visible to camera. That basically makes it invisible to camera, but the lighting effect is still there. And of course, we're going to adjust the color again because our environment's slightly warmer than it is cooler. We'll just set it to around this area, slightly less maybe, and there we go. So there you have it. There's your three main key points, right? And honestly, I think there would be a bit of light that'll come out of out of these reflections, because the light will bounce onto the product itself. So as an option, it's up to you if you want to do this or not. But again, this is very subjective on how you want to set up your in context. But I think we could add. We're just gonna duplicate the spotlight up here. I think we can add a little bit of rim light down here as well. Okay, so duplicate. There you go. Duplicated the one on top. Use our geometry view. Push this down. Rotate it the other way around, and there you have our rim light. But we don't want it too bright as well. We kind of just want it to be almost barely visible, but still be there. It's the little tiny details that count. So we can double click on the materials. We can adjust the power. Instead of watts, we're going to lumens. So around 15 is pretty much fine too. Maybe we would go 20. So a little bit of rim light onto here. Increase the fall off too, and adjust it slightly more so that it is a bit further. More here. There you go. So again, super tiny detail. It's an optional thing, honestly, but might as well just add it. So overall, let's take a look at the lighting effects that we've done to set up this file so far. We've added the backlight, which is our spotlight over here, that creates this nice rim light effect to match the environment. Then we added our point light. Our point light is our key light, main source of light, basically to light the whole 3D model, and then our area light, which is our fill light. So again, this makes our completely um, dark side of our products a little bit more noticeable or more detailed. We can see a lot more of the design with the fill light, so it's not completely erased. Honestly, we can make this a little bit more darker than it is. There you go. So key light is just there to kind of highlight it, just give it a little punch. Then our optional spotlight, just so that the rim here kind of doesn't blend too much away from us. So there you go. And it also kind of bounces light from here. So yeah, there's our lighting. And now for again, we're going to go back to our 3D environment. I think the reflection here is looking too flat. There's nothing like bouncing off of it. And so the way that we could address that is through playing with our lighting environment. So with this rotation tool, we can, as you can see, we can get a couple of different reflections out of it. Um, and you know what? I'm going to decrease the blur a bit because I want it to be a bit more defined. And I think what would be great is if we can somehow find an angle where it seems like the head of this person is kind of reflecting off of um off of the screen. So let's just see if we can find a certain angle. And you could use the transform tool also in your HDRI to get more kind of a more different angle of the lighting. So you can take your time to go ahead and play with it. I'm looking for a specific angle, but anyways, you could do it like this, or oh, there you go. I think this might be a good one. If we lower, by lowering I mean by tilting. Yeah, it seems like it's the head is kind of reflecting onto the screen, right? So we can rotate it a bit. We don't want it to completely take over everything. So there you have it. There's our reflection, and if you're wondering if it's maybe in your screen is a bit pixelated, the lighting environment is a little bit pixelated. It's because we simply haven't clicked this button, which updates the whole lighting environment. So just click on that, it'll update it, and there you have it. It's a bit more HD than it was before. Now, now that we kind of pretty much set up a lot of these things, we can go ahead and go to the image tab section over here. Now, as a default, Keyshot would set it to a basic, and this is where you could adjust all of your other basically similar to what Photoshop does, where you could, or Lightroom does, where you can adjust the color and contrast. And that's exactly what we're gonna do. But instead of basic, I encourage everyone to use the photographic tool. So again, you can kind of adjust your contrast. Maybe we want a little bit more contrast. If you want it to make it brighter, maybe just a smidge bit brighter. We don't Seems pretty bright itself already, and we can do a lot more post processing later on, and we can turn on the curve. And if you can't tell, I've already kind of adjusted the curve to a previous scene, but this is where you could mess around. We have other options here that are preset, but I just encourage to use or just kind of eyeball it and see what kind of effect you want. So I kind of wanted more contrast. The mid tones slightly darker. We don't need it that bright, right? Don't want it too contrasting. So there you go. Your lights, you can just adjust it however you want. And honestly, I think it's way too saturated. The orange is bouncing off way too saturated. And a basic way to do that is by going to your double click on your material, and then we could adjust it to make it slightly darker than it really is. So yeah, something slightly darker, just so that it's not grabbing too much attention away from the rest of the image or the rest of the product. So, all right, going back to our image tab, we messed with the curve and histogram part of it. Now we can also mess with the color. Let's turn this on. Um, we could mess with the saturation again. If it's too saturated, we could dim it down a bit, or we could amp it up a bit. But I think it's already kind of saturated, so we can slightly dim it down if we wanted to. And then for our vibrance tool, again, I wouldn't recommend maxing everything because that I'll show you what it looks like. There you go. So we don't really want that happening. Um, so just eyeball it and see what it like where it starts to kind of feel or look right. Again, all of these things we can touch on later in Photoshop once we get to it. Okay. Now, denoise, such a useful tool, especially if you're working on close angles on your 3D model, especially with the materials. Some materials would cause a little bit more noise than we want to, and this is where denoise comes in handy. As a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't go past point 0.5 or point 0.6. That's because we're losing a lot of details once we go beyond that point. What the denoise tool does basically softens up your entire image, softens up your material texture, and we don't, just as an example, we can soften it up right now. You can't really tell because we're in a far angle, but you can kind of see the noise or like the texture is no longer there. So that's the reason why we can set it up to maybe just point 0.1 even, because we're not really in a close angle. We don't, it's not super the denoise is not super needed. So for fireflies, these are a very useful tool, especially when you have your caustics on. Again, there are sometimes stray lights, stray points of like white points that are just scattered everywhere. This is where your firefly filter would come in handy. Again, only use it when you need to. It seems like we don't have much of fireflies as of the moment, so I think we can leave it at this very low numeral. So sharpen, I don't typically touch that. Again, it's completely up to you and how you want everything to look. If you increase sharpen, you can see kind of has a little bit of a weird and janky effect. So now let's take a look at bloom. Bloom is a really interesting one. So if we zoomed in onto the image, we can see the full effect of what bloom actually does. So we increase the bloom intensity to around like 1, and maybe increase the bloom radius to around maybe 100. You can see, whoa, oh my lord. It looks like a very it looks like it comes from like a K-drama or something. It has that nice like soft filter onto it. But again, up to you on what effect or what intention you're trying to make your product seem like it has. Maybe it has like this nice like filter effect or Snapchat filter on it, and that's why we have this bloom effect that's super high. But we don't really need it that high. We can tone it down a bit, and then the radius is what makes it super soft. We can put it to around, let's mess with around like 12 for now. We don't really need it. It's not super realistic if we have it super high, so we can mess around with it around that area. Threshold is um basically it's the point wherein the bloom effect will kick in if this light source is bright enough or brighter than your threshold. That's when the bloom effect will kick in. Any like lumen or something that's lower than the bloom threshold, that's where the bloom effect won't kick in. So again, you can adjust to your preference. As of the moment, we could leave it as it was because it's pretty intense, the light sources that we have here. I think it's too bloomed. We can dial it back down a bit, honestly. There you go. All right. So we've got our bloom effect done. Now, lastly, we can take a look at the chromatic aberration. Chromatic aberration basically gives off basically all of the photos that we take using our smartphones typically has chromatic aberration. So if you want to take a look at the effect of chromatic aberration, let's just set this to the highest, and it is a very slight change. And you know what? I'm gonna turn this for chromatic aberration. I usually like to turn it on and put it as a contrasting color of the background. Most people can't really tell. There is something happening. It's kind of like a slight blur to it. It's just something that cameras normally have. It's optional if you want it or not, but just so that it's more realistic, it feels like a little bit more like a camera took a picture of it. We could activate it and put it on. And let's go back to our original perspective. There you go. And you know what I've been noticing? I think we're gonna make our brightness just a smidge darker. There you go. All right. In our spotlight here, on the original beginning, maybe you can make it just a smidge lower. Okay. So we've gotten our lighting done. We've gotten our kind of pre-post processing done. We've gotten our environment all fixed up, and now it's probably time to render out. So we're gonna bring this into Photoshop later on, and because we're gonna be doing that, we really just want to render out the product itself, the 3D model itself, and not the background, so that we could make these fingers kind of pop up and feels like it's the person's actually holding onto this product. And so let's first of all, let's like take a look at our image in resolutions. Let's make sure we're in the same boat here. All right, nice. So click on render, and this is gonna pop up a bunch of things. Again, you can set it to any destination you want. You can name it whatever you want. Just know where it is. Resolution right now we're at 4K. Again, it depends on what you need. Typically, 1080, 920 by 1080, you're good to go, unless you're presenting it in a very uh, official or professional way. Maybe then you want it on the 4K area. I usually put it on the 4K area just because that gives me room for flexibility in case I want to rescale the thing or like zoom in on certain parts of the thing so that it's not pixelated when we do that. And so have this all set up, and because we just want the 3D model to be rendered out and we don't want the environment rendered with it, make sure to put it as PNG, and then also turn on your alpha, include alpha, or basically, in short, just makes your thing transparent and not include the background. So after that, we can go to our options again. For sample size, professors usually recommend around 800 samples. That's already good enough, but I would urge people to go around 1,000 samples to really get those materials nice and more crisp. If you have a more powerful PC, go 3,000. But beyond like 5,000 or 6,000 or something like that, you won't really be noticing it too much already. It's that those amount of samples is too much to that extent where our eyes don't really pick up on it anymore. So you could put it to 1,000. At the moment, I have a decent PC, so I put it on 3,000. There's no harm in that. Again, the larger your sample size, the longer your render is going to take. So at this point, you could probably queue it up if you have any other renders, or just completely hit render and it'll render out our 3D model here. And just for the sakes of this video, I've already pre-rendered it for us over here. And if it'll open or not, it could completely crash your system because you have so much tabs open. Okay, There you go. There you go. So we pre-rendered it. Again, this is in 4K, so we can kind of relatively zoom in and without it kind of being pixelated up to a certain extent. But just remember to match your aspect ratio to whatever your background is, just so that you can make it easier. And then now that we have all of our assets, typically you would have a blank page. And I have the same resolution as the one we've seen here before. It's like 3000 by something something. It's 4K resolution. So we'll import our images. So our image for this one is we imported this one, let's say, and then we can import our render. Now, the reason why I say that try to make sure it's in the same aspect or resolutions is just so that you can literally quite drag and drop it without having to try to fiddle if this is the exact same angle that we want it, or this exact same position that it was on in our Keyshot. So yeah, we already know that is exactly how we rendered it. Okay, we have a render, we have our background, and the thing is our background is no longer really matching the color scheme of our render over here. So we can quickly address that by going into our adjustment layer. Where is it? There you go. This small little icon right here is our adjustment layer. And then like what we did in Keyshot, let's click on curves, and then we can adjust our image here to something similar to how we had it in our Keyshot. So again, a little bit more contrast, right? We had a little bit more contrast to that. Maybe not too much. Maybe that's a bit too much. A little bit, something like that. So play around with it. At this point, it's very subjective to what you want the look and feel of your render. I wanted more contrast, so there you go. A little bit there. Okay, perfect. Um, now that we've done that, the reason why I also wanted to use adjustment layer instead of simply rasterizing the whole thing and putting on the filter on is so that we can always turn it off and turn it on and have the flexibility in case we made an error or we want to revert back to its original image. So the next thing that we want to do is probably take care of the thing behind it. Like, what is this? This is some sort of weirdly made teacup. So we want to get rid of that. And the easiest way to do that, and I'm so glad Photoshop added this, is through their generative AI or your generative fill. So we can go ahead and grab our lasso tool, select the pretty much the points that we kind of want to remove. So around this area, we want to remove that. We want to remove this area. Want to remove this area, and there you go. So now that we've selected or masked out the portion that we want to remove, we can hit the generative fill tool here. Just click on it. You could simply hit generate and see what it gives you. But you know what? Just for the sakes of example, let's do that. So generate. Now, this generative tool is a hit or miss. It could take you quite some time maybe to find exactly what you're looking for. In our case, it's not it gave us another phone or some sort of device, and it gave us some sort of coded message. Maybe it says help me, but we don't need that, so we can be a bit more specific. We say remove. So the AI will maybe know that we want it to remove that the teacup thing that's on the original image. So let's see what it gives us. Again, hit or miss. All right, it's gave us some weird stuff this time. So maybe not, right? Maybe we could let's delete that. Maybe we could redo that. This again might take some time. Let's give it another shot and see if it gives us something a little bit more better than what we were receiving. So the ultimate goal is basically trying to get it as close as making this part disappear. But generative AI is a little bit tweaky sometimes. So it'll give us maybe a smaller object or some sort of deformality here, but that is completely fine because we know that our render is going to be covering that anyways. So, oh my lord. Okay, so gave us a brass knuckle this time. Okay, that took around maybe an additional 2-3 minutes of trying to generate, but we finally got to a relatively decent looking hand without that. But this person probably needs to cut their nails. Again, if we look at actually our example, I kind of did this in advance. You can see how much generative layers I kind of went through. If it's really giving you a hard time or a struggle, you could do it by portion, like how I did here, where we remove the top portion first, then we remove the bottom, and then there's some like weird stuff happening here. So we like maybe this hand is the shadow of this hand is looking a bit weird. We can also address that. All right. So at this case, we got our relatively decent hand, right? That's empty. And so we can now turn on our render right here, which there you go, there you have it. And then now we can try to basically make the background of the fingers more onto the foreground. And the way we could do that is through simply get rid of this file, and then we can simply start erasing from our render, but don't go ahead and don't rasterize this and then start erasing the actual images, because if we make a mistake we can't undo it. So what I want you to do is turn on your layer mask, click on this icon, and then make sure you're not selected on the image, but make sure select on the mask itself. Here we can press E on your keyboard, and then we have a brush, a eraser brush. The way you could adjust how I'm adjusting right now is by holding Alt and then moving your mouse up or down so that it controls the hardness, and then left or right to control the size. So we can zoom in here a bit. We kind of want a slightly soft brush, but not too soft. Then we can start erasing parts here. We can increase the softness a bit. There you go. Just so that it relatively matches the shape of the finger that it's originally there. At this point, you're basically adding the cherry on top. So take your time on when you're doing this. There you go. So relatively it's there. But for example, what if we accidentally, whoops, we messed up, or we added an extra line that we didn't want, something like this. That's what's great about doing using a layer mask, is that if we press B on the other hand instead of E, we're using the brush tool, we can slowly put back the stuff that we kind of accidentally made, right? Be like Bob Ross here. There are no mistakes, just happy little accidents. So I'm gonna turn on the brush a little bit higher. So relatively something like that. We can work on it for hours and hours, try to get it as perfect and as we want. But for now, we can leave it as such. Okay. Now that we have this finger, let's try to address the other one. So same thing. Try to get the finger to blend it in. There you go. Kind of want to see how it looks. So the finger kind of goes here. You go. Yeah, something like that. Something like this would do. Again, take your time to really make it more realistic in terms of your layer mask and how you're erasing this. But for our case right now, we can leave it as is. All right. Now, for this one, we don't really need it because the thumb is going to be on this sort of knob. And now we can start to consider what are the other things that we can make to add to this to make it a little bit more realistic and feel like it's more in the scene. Because right now it looks like we kind of just slapped it on there, and it's not really yet part of the scene, right? So the way we could add more depth to this image is by adding occlusion shadows. So there's a professor at SCAD. I want you to guess in the comments below, uh, who always says if you take his class, occlusion shadows. Occlusion shadows is the answer to everything. So write in the comments if you think whoever said that. So there you go. We're gonna be adding occlusion shadows or shadows, drop shadows, shadows in general. So the way we do that is we'll make another layer. We'll make a brush. We'll get on the brush, set it to around, maybe around like a black, kind of near black. And we can soften our brush up a bit here. And then we can start kind of make it slightly even more softer. We can start to kind of brush along the general direction we kind of want the occlusion shadow to be at, right? We don't want it too dark. We don't want it too drastic. But something like that, right? Right now, it looks like the person got bruised in their fingernails, but don't worry, that is where we will use the layer mask again and start subtracting and erasing some of these tiny little things that we don't need. So again, start to erase these things. We don't need these such dark spots over here. We just kind of want the trace of the fingers. And then we can soften it up a bit for the parts that here so it's not super hard edged. Soften this up a bit. Okay, so we're kind of there. Kind of wanted to make this a little bit more rounder. A little bit more rounder than it is right now. All right, you can go erase this. Rounder. A little bit rounder than it is. Cool. Again, you can work on this for hours and hours to really get that perfect like shadow or perfect finger shape. But as of the moment, this will do. This will do. That's what I tell myself, even though I'm constantly zooming back in and trying to edit it. But anyways, all right. Same thing happens to this finger over here. Get our brush. Start adding the occlusion shadows. Occlusion. All the way back here. Slightly darker. All right. Then going back to our layer mask, start to erase some of these things. You can make the eraser brush a little bit harder. There you go. Start to erase. If you do have a stylus or one of those Wacom tablets, this is gonna be so much easier. I'm currently using my mouse. Although I do have a Wacom tablet, I just like a little bit of more challenge into my life, a little bit more spice. Just nothing bad, you know. So there you go. We have a little bit of occlusion shadow right here. We can kind of erase a little bit right there. And there you go. There's our occlusion shadow. And maybe it's too dark, right? And that's what I love about layers. We can adjust the opacity of it. If it's too dark, or if it's too light, you can always kind of adjust it to get that sweet spot. Then we can kind of erase. We missed a couple of little things. All right. Okay. So next up is probably we're wondering where's the shadow here. We probably need a shadow there. We could again use the brush to kind of remedy that, or if we can do it smartly, if you look at your reference image, let's look at our reference image. I vaguely remember having some sort of shadow right here already, right? So we can use that somewhat to our advantage. So looking at our generative AI, it has a layer mask to it. So we can edit that layer mask and kind of bring back the original image that's just right behind it. So we could, there you go. We could erase it and slowly bring back the original image. And there you go. You kind of have like a shadow there already. And yeah, pretty much there's our shadow. I think we're missing another shadow here, just as a final touch up to it, right? So again, boop, boop, boop. We can make this darker. Boop, boop, boop. It's not as dark as before because we have the layer opacity to a lighter color now. So, boop. Now it doesn't look quite there yet because we could actually add a bit of direction towards the shadow, right? So we knowing that the lighting is coming from behind it, we could kind of make this a little bit darker so we can just see it a bit better. We could kind of fix the direction of the shadow. So kind of want the shadow to not too harsh, but to kind of be in this direction. So let's erase it towards that direction. So it seems like there's like a ray of light that's passing through. And we can erase this part of the image of the shadow layer. A bit too much. Again, try to spend more time doing this. Kind of speed running through it right now. Okay, so something like that. You can work on the shadows a little bit better, but there you go. By adding a bit more of a occlusion shadow to it, it feels like the object is actually there and not really just like a PNG. There you go. And now, as a final touch, this is definitely optional, but to make the background image and the context render a bit more cohesive and together, this is where we could add like maybe filters or whatever color that we want, but I'm happy to where it is right now. Maybe we can even make it brighter. Again, we can always just hit adjust, then the adjustment layer, and then maybe we can go to curves. Maybe you can make it, we can use Photoshop's auto tool to make it see what it thinks. It's a bit too bright, I think. So we can tone it down a bit. Ooh, maybe not. It's a bit, it's getting too bright, I think. I think it's getting a little bit too bright. I'm pretty happy to from where we were at a while ago. So again, that's why we're using adjustment tool. If it's too bright, we just hit delete. Okay. So let's say we're happy with this. We're happy where we are. We're satisfied with our lives. So next, we wanna select on the folder that, or well, select on your files, basically from wherever you started, and then you're gonna hit Control J. That's gonna duplicate your file. Actually, let's pretty much just hit highlight the folder and just Control J that. So that pretty much duplicates the file that we had here, the folder that we had here. So we can turn this off. We don't need that anymore. What we need is, and what we're gonna edit is this one. Always make it a good habit to duplicate certain files, especially if you're gonna make a big edit on it. So for this one, we're gonna merge it. We can merge it by pressing Control E. That merges it really quickly. And then we're gonna go ahead and add like the very cherry on top. Like this is the cherry of the cherry on top, you know. So go ahead and click on your image. Go to filter, then go over hover to noise, and then add noise. So what noise does for me is it kind of ties the background and the foreground or the product render a lot better. so that it seems like they've been taken a picture of using the same camera. So if you want to see the full effect, maybe we can go like 50. Boom. Oh my god. Oh, okay. It looks like a VHS tape. So we don't need that. We can just a tiny little bit. Just a tiny little bit. And there you have it. Okay. Then click OK. So as you can see, it's a little bit more kind of congruent with each other. So yeah, pretty much this. You can go ahead and save this as whatever file you want. We're doing 4K right now. Save it, and pretty much that is the how to make a context render specifically on this type of shot where you have a hand holding on it. And please do take more time, especially on the hands, on how to make it more realistic. Don't forget about the occlusion shadows. And yeah, pretty much that's this workshop. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know it's been like an hour probably of this recording. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video or the next workshop. Peace.